James Tabor is a professor of Christian origins and ancient Judaism at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte in the United States. His PhD is from the University of Chicago, and he's previously taught at the University of Notre Dame, or Notre Dame, as we say in England, and the university and at the College of William and Mary. He's combined his work on ancient texts with extensive fieldwork in archaeology in Israel and Jordan. And since 2008, he has been co-director of the acclaimed Mount Zion excavation in Jerusalem and been involved in half a dozen other archaeological projects in the Holy Land over the past 30 years. In the early 90s, he was involved in the release of the unpublished, at that time, Dead Sea Scrolls, and was one of the first scholars to examine and publish several very important ones. In 1995, he testified before the US Congress on the Waco tragedy, drawing on his expertise in understanding ancient biblical apocalyptic ideas. He's written numerous books and publications, and I won't list them all. We'll be here all night. You have it. It's not intended to be flattery. I've read a few books, and I must say your writing style is very compelling. You have a talent clearly for coming up with some extraordinary turns of phrase and crafting a very interesting and sentence or a paragraph. So and academics are not always known, shall we say, for their stimulating narrative, but you certainly are. The two books of yours that I've read, which I've just finished, Paul and Jesus, How the Apostle Transformed Christianity. You can see a very provocative title, how he transformed Christianity. And this one that you've already mentioned, the Jesus Dynasty, stunning new evidence about the hidden history of Jesus. And this has some very interesting discussions, which we'll hopefully come to in a second, about the early church and James and Jesus and a few other people. So if I may just perhaps introduce...
Let me mention, before you go to that, this is just out, so people might be interested. It's another book on Paul. It's called Paul's Ascent to Paradise. I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah, Paul's Ascent to Paradise. Yeah, I can see that, yes.
My dissertation way back at Chicago was on Paul's Ascent to Paradise, and this is shaped out of that. Mm-hmm. But this is after, 40 years of reflecting on Paul. So it's my newest book on Paul. It's more academic, still, I think, pretty accessible. But you're right about the Jesus Dynasty and Paul and Jesus. Those are Simon & Schuster trade books. We usually say they're for the educated non-specialist, is sort of the term the publishers use. But I find that, I'm not writing to my colleagues per se, as so many books within New Testament studies, but I'm writing for the public. So.
Oh yes, no, I can see that, and that's why your books. You share something in common, like with Bart Ehrman, I think, Professor Bart Ehrman, who's not a million miles from where you are, I think, in writing books, not just for fellow colleagues and academia, but also for the educated general public, very successfully. You both seem to have broken into that market big time over the years. And are you part of the same university, or are you actually a different university entirely?
Yeah, Bart is at Chapel Hill, which is about 2 hours from here, in the Triangle near Duke and North Carolina State. And Charlotte is, of course, the largest urban center in North Carolina. Right. And Bart's Chapel Hill is much older, 1789, I think it was formed. It's one of the oldest public universities in America. So they've got some history on us. We were formed in 1946, but we're a large urban university with a really thriving Department of Religious Studies. Indeed. Really glad to be here. I like being at a large state school. I like my students. I like the variety and diversity of the students. So it doesn't have any kind of seminary atmosphere.
Right.
And so I'm able to teach broad courses on religious studies and what is religion and what is history and how do we investigate things and so forth.
Oh, very interesting. Well, you have an enviable job, I must say. So if I could perhaps come to a question that arises from a comment a fascinating comment I think you made towards the end of the 4th chapter in your book, Paul and Jesus, which really struck me. And again, it kind of bears witness to your wordsmith ability. Very well written. You say, if we can resist making assumptions and pick up Paul's letters, and Paul, of course, is the author of many, many letters in the New Testament. If we can pick up his letters with fresh eyes, we will capture an amazing moment in time for which he is our only first-hand source. We will learn how Paul transformed the original Christianity into a new religion that claimed to abrogate and supersede the old by moving everything from earth to heaven. Now, that's an extraordinary statement. Would you mind just unpacking that a bit, both in Paul's role in changing this original Christianity and how he moved everything from this terrestrial plane to the heavenlies?
Yes. Let me start with just the idea. There's a chapter that relates to this in the book called, I don't know if I use this title, but it's about reading the New Testament backwards. And the idea would be that instead of opening up, as most readers do, probably start with Matthew if they don't have any other guidance, even though most of us think Mark was first. But you have the impression that you're reading the beginning, the beginning of the movement, John the Baptist and Jesus, and if you do Luke or Matthew, the birth of Jesus. And then you're just going along. And because Luke also has Acts, then you get the history of the church. And as you well know, it should probably be called the Acts of Paul and a couple of things about the apostles rather than the Acts of the Apostles. Yes. So Paul immediately comes on the scene as the main force. And then you go into Paul's letters, Romans and so forth. And Romans hits you first, and that's a treatise in a very developed way, probably Paul's most mature theological presentation of his gospel, as he calls it. And you have the idea that you're just following along chronologically. And so what I try to emphasize, and remember, this is for general readers, I think my colleagues are well aware of this, but my students certainly aren't, is it's better to think, what do we first know about the movement? What's the earliest thing that we know? And that would be Paul's letter to, we call it Thessalonians, the little cell group, the little Christian group at Thessalonica. And that would be our first glimpse. And then we can go on through Paul's letters. There are 13 letters with Paul's name. Most scholars limit their serious consideration of Paul, let's call it the core Paul, to 7 of those letters. So the Corinthian correspondence, Philippians, even Philemon gets in, the one page to the slave owner, Onesimus, and so forth. So the idea of that statement is that we're capturing something in the letters that is actually earlier and more formative in terms of the movement, as far as a witness, so that when we come to the Gospels, it could well be, and I try to argue this, that the theology we're getting, the dominant theology that we're getting in Mark certainly and in Luke, to some degree paralleled in John, in Matthew is a kind of derivative of Mark, is very much a version of Paul. And so to get back at John the Baptist or Jesus, we have to do this thing that we scholars have been talking about now, 150 years, the so-called quest for the historical Jesus. What was Jesus of Nazareth as a human being actually like before Paul came along, before Jesus became the Christ, as Paul calls him. And so the fresh eyes that I want people to have is actually we're very privileged to have these 7 letters. Most of us think there are very few interpolations, if any. We're actually getting something firsthand. So if you want to study religious experience, you want to study testimony, sometimes people say, well, what do you know about James? Well, I know we're going to talk about that, the brother of Jesus. Paul's our best witness, because he actually says, I went and saw him and I visited him. So imagine you're reading a letter by someone who actually met James, and he gives you firsthand testimony. Not that he tells us enough, we wish we had more, but by putting things together, we begin to form a picture. So that statement is an attempt to say that the movement as it originally started was on earth, not in heaven. As the prayer Jesus taught his disciples says, let your will be done on earth, not in heaven, or as it is in heaven, rather. It was coming very much out of the Hebrew prophets, particularly Isaiah 2, Isaiah 11, these messianic prophecies about the last days, when the mountain of the Lord's house will be established, all the nations will flow to it. The nations will learn the one God, Yahweh or Jehovah, and turn and be taught the Torah and so forth. Paul certainly believed those texts and sometimes even alludes to them, but he has a more, I would argue, a more heavenly version of those texts. He's allegorizing them, as he clearly says sometimes, like in Galatians. He said, well, Jerusalem above is what we're interested in, not Jerusalem below. And that gets echoed even in books like the book of Hebrews, where you go through this whole history and then you talk about, we have not come to a mountain that can be touched, Sinai. Also, Paul says in 2 Corinthians 3, where, Moses, that was a certain glory, but that's now faded because now we have a heavenly glory. And it can sound almost like Plato, but it's not. And I try to explain that. Because when Paul says in 2 Corinthians 4, we look to the things that are unseen, not the things that are seen. For the things that are unseen are eternal, and the things that are seen are temporal. That could be in the Phaedo. That could be in the Timaeus. Yeah. It's basically dualistic, Hellenistic, Platonic philosophy.
Exactly.
And so if Jesus and James and John the Baptist had a different understanding of the kingdom of God, not so much that there's no, miracles or divine intervention or great things happening, but it's on earth rather than in heaven, where Paul begins to develop this idea of, I think it's his greatest idea, actually, it's the greatest idea in Paul, not making a judgment on whether it's great, but it's the greatest idea in Paul, is that God actually created the material world, this is Romans 8, as a kind of a physical, mortal, perishing mock-up, you might say, like Adam 1 of the dust. And the purpose of that is, as a prototype, to create this new genus of heavenly beings,
right?
The first of whom is Jesus of Nazareth. So the earth is almost like a womb for these sons of God, these children, we should say children of God, because it's not really gender identified, the offspring of God that are going to be, and Jesus is the firstborn of many. So just that whole heavenly perspective, not so much in a locative sense, like you have to go somewhere to get to heaven and leave the earth, but literally the dissolving of what is seen so that what is unseen can remain. And it is really what Christianity finally settles on. I mean, if you ask the average person, as you well know, what's your Christian hope? They probably wouldn't even mention resurrection of the dead unless you prompted them. They would probably say, well, when I die, even the apocalyptic is gone. When I die, that'll be my end. And I hope I face the judgment and I go to heaven. At least in America, that's the phrase you hear. Are you absolutely sure that when you die, you will go to heaven? Because there'll be this judgment and so forth. So now Paul is not all the way down that pike, completely throwing off all of his Jewish vocabulary and concepts. Of course, he still has resurrection of the dead. We can talk about that as we go on. But we have to ask, in what kind of a body do they come? As he was asked by the Corinthians. And it turns out that he can't even tell you what kind of body it is. But it obviously is not 2 arms, 2 legs, and a face like we have now, because he says it'll be as different as, say, an acorn from an oak tree. I tell my students, say, a cocoon or caterpillar and a butterfly. It's transformation. He actually uses the word metamorphosis. So Paul, now I don't want to give the impression, Paul, your name is Paul, that Paul has invented something new. These are currents within Judaism. Judaism is already thoroughly Hellenized in many, many ways. And by Hellenized, I don't mean just picking up Greek customs and having some Greek art in your home, but it's already beginning. You can see it in Josephus. When he talks about the immortal soul and the changing of the ages, it can sound almost apocalyptic, but it's really closer to Plato than, say, the Hebrew Bible. Whereas the Hebrew Bible is, the picture that you get is Israel has been scattered to the nations. They're going to get gathered. They're going to be gathered back.
Yep.
And Jerusalem will become a kind of spiritual center of the world. And there'll be a new temple that'll be a house of prayer for all people, as Jesus said last week of his life. And Herodian temple is going to go. And whether there would be sacrifices or not, I'm thinking Jesus is probably leaning more towards what the Ebionites later said, that, you know, the sacrifices were temporary accommodations to human sin and weakness and so forth. But that the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Now, what am I quoting there? Isaiah 11, which is the messianic chapter in the entire Old Testament or Hebrew Bible. A root will come forth from the stump of Jesse, David's father, talking about the Davidic Messiah. And if you just ask, what is the Davidic Messiah going to do? The things that he's going to do are not the things that Paul lays out in Romans 1-8. Now, we can talk about 9. I know many of your listeners know the Bible. I don't want to just, call these signals out like flashcards, but 9, 10, and 11, he does address the situation with what he calls Israel according to the flesh. But he's very keen on saying we don't know Jesus any longer according to the flesh.
Yes.
Even if we once knew him. Well, who once knew him according to the flesh? Peter.
James.
James, you see. And so I think he's proposing a new system. I think it enables Christianity to survive in a certain way that it probably wouldn't have otherwise. The Ebionites didn't do too well.
No.
Apocalyptic has a 100% failure rate so far. I tell my students,